Morning, morning, monsters. Today we will be talking about the potential for RTX as one of the sort of the dominance of path tracing to change up the visuals of games. So, for those of you unaware, we're just going to sort of quickly run through some major graphics moments, very, very briefly, to give you a sort of feeling for the premise. So if you go back to sort of, I'm going to say early arcade gaming, really, you've got very limited palettes, and everything is two-dimensional. I mean, prior to that, there is actually this period where you have what I'd call the overlay period, or the printed physical graphics period, but let's not go back too far. We've got early arcade and early PC gaming and early console gaming as well, defined by these limited 2D palettes. Additionally, there is a secondary restriction on them where you actually had dedicated hardware for sprites. In fact, it's quite hilarious. In one of the early consoles, you actually had a dedicated ball sprite graphic because they could never picture a video game not needing a ball, and there was special hardware to make the ball move around quite fast. So for these reasons, because of the and you also had a low resolution. For these reasons, the graphics stylings of the period tended towards static backgrounds with a handful of moving sprites in low-res limited palettes. And the styling, the art, the technology limit was so harsh, art stylings didn't really start to appear. That was more on the box art than it was in the actual game. But then we start moving up to sort of the VGA area, with no sprites. So this is sort of VGA double buffer, but still low res. And this is also, now, no matter how much technology affects this, there is still a cultural element. This is also peak 90s. This is a lot of the garish colors. So this is the jazz jackrabbit age, right? So we're very, very colorful, but here you start to get more parallax backgrounds. You start to get generally more motion in the screen. Animation starts smoothing out, but you also tend to get, whereas here there was quite a distinct style that was defined by the technology, here you started to get a bit more freedom. But I would say that traditional animation, hand-drawn animation, sort of dominated in stylings. And then we sort of get the branch off between 2D and 3D happening, where there were specifically different tech stacks. 2D lent strong into sort of strong cartoon style. There were some FMV stylings, specifically with CD-ROM games, and that was where we had very low res, so we're talking like 240p video roundabout, and so that was going quite a realistic route. But then we also had other stuff going much more sort of Saturday morning cartoons, because they had the quality, they had the animation. But then over in this other branch, this new branch, we had the start of 3D, and this is where some new interesting visual stylings creep in. So if you look at sort of Wolf and Doom, right, these stylings of games, first of all, you have no up and down on the camera. Everything is still drawn sprites, and it's software 3D and such. So you've still got quite vibrant colors, quite still a limited palette, generally speaking, because your biggest restriction here, for the reason for the limited palette, is memory. So you got to limit this palette of the textures to keep it all within sort of operation and things. And also the vibrant textures and the high contrast stuff works better with how this is coming across. I think because sort of at this time you've also got moving into sort of the Duke 3D of the world. And Duke 3D, by the way, a lot of people don't know there is actually a Duke 1 and 2 games, which are side-scrolling platformers. They sort of continue that, even though they're aimed at a mature audience, that cartoony vibe. Doom as well, with the sort of vibrant pink monsters and stuff. And as I say, a lot of this is to do with how the rendering technique works better with high contrast imagery and the limited memory. But then we've got sort of an interesting moment that happens where, oh yes, and also the lighting in these are very baked off, and you actually zone off the lighting in these. But then we have a very interesting thing happen. We have Quake happen. And Quake is interesting for a few reasons. One, it's got dynamic lighting. The dynamic lighting is very limited, but it also tries to, because it's got this dynamic lighting wouldn't suit a garish texture set because it wouldn't light that up as well. So what they do is they've still got very limited memory, but they take their palette down and they basically wash everything in I suppose I should just draw it. They wash everything in sort of muted browns, and it becomes very low poly, sharp edges. The whole sort of style becomes everything is so sharp and contrasty in its edges because everything is so low poly that they try to hide that sharpness with muddiness in the texture style. And now basically we go into, I wouldn't say the dark ages of 3D, but basically everyone in 3D can go two ways. They can go super garish, and a few people do go this way, but it feels, partly because of where we've come from with VGA and stuff, it feels more sort of the VGA area than it does feel here, so it makes games feel a bit dated. So you do have some games go this route, but with Quake we start actually with the dynamic lighting and everything, we start to go much more towards sort of realism as a style. Now I will also say, interestingly enough, Nintendo is sort of a bubble over here with Super Mario Galaxy and everything, but one of the things that makes Nintendo's visual style work better on their consoles is during this sort of era they have a very strong bit of tech called TEV, which is texture environment variables, and it allows for a lot of scrolling UVs. And we might actually do an entire talk at some point on TEVs and scrolling UVs, but it's basically loads of ways to make like water look good. They also had quite good sampling for alpha. Their alpha sampling for textures was quite good in terms of sort of 1-bit alpha stuff. So you could do sort of cartoony edges, and that was generally where their stylings were going. You saw some of that on PC, but not as much. As we sort of go forward with this and we start to go into the early days of pixel shaders, so we're talking sort of early 2000s here, there's a few things. We're getting the poly counts up. Lighting is still very primitive. I'd say this is still lighting V2 at this point. You've got pixel shaders and vertex shaders, sorry, early 2000s, but things are still tending towards realism, but you've got to hide a lot. It's a lot of grit. It's a lot of grime. Now at this point, there's a sort of a tangential bubble that's worth mentioning. That's not big AAA games, but it's worth mentioning. Is you've got Flash going on, and Flash is super vibrant. It's vector art. It's carrying on. It's an indie style. With Flash in the early 2000s, by the way, the old 2D pipeline here is now dying out. At this point, 2D is 3D, right? So you've got two-dimensional games using three-dimensional games. And this is a very interesting bubble, because this bubble will somewhat expand, but it'll sort of stay away from our main thread of advancement. But you've got most of the games that are trying to look high budget, and most of the games that are trying to look sort of cutting edge are in this tech war, but they're in this tech war that's fighting with still quite limited shader tech. Then we move on to sort of, this is like 2008, 2005 period, and one of the big deals here is MMO and streaming streaming textures, I'd say, streaming landscapes. Now, this sounds funny, but this is where the technology pushes them in an interesting direction. This is when we're designing large spaces for the person to traverse, but video memory is still quite small. The secondary issue is if you ever want to transfer this over, if you ever want to download this, bandwidth for downloading these textures is relatively small. So then what starts happening is you start to get a lot of hand aliased textures. So this would be like someone's like, oh, here's sort of a banner stripe here, here's sort of a decal image here, whatever. And this is the period where artists and level designers are actually going in and they're designing these 3D environments where the bulk of the 3D environment is of 1 to maybe 4 textures. And because of this, because of how the decal styling works, and because of it's quite hard to go gritty with this, is specifically in the MMO space and in also web game space, and some sort of streaming landscape stuff, so some of like the early GTA stuff, you've got the art style being pushed towards, I wouldn't use the phrase cartoony, but it's more distinct, because these decals are effectively like stickers that are being stuck on in places, and you've got these sort of little gradients where so what will happen is like someone will have like a little gradient going from red to sort of a darker red here to there, and then you'll have like a blue version of that. And because of how this is set up, the artists would be saying, okay, I'm going to take that little section there and I can use that to make this polygon here blue, right? And so they can quite have this low poly thing to be blue, because vertex memory is cheaper than graphics memory. So they're doing that stuff, and then what they're doing is they're saying, okay, then I'm going to take this and I'm going to put this decal here, and then that's going to make it look like, instead of having like 4-sided cube that's quite heavily textured and using a lot of texture memory, I'm using this decal method to hide a lot of this. And so because of this, you've got some of the pushback to the realism drive in MMOs and web games and stuff. And as I say, a lot of the innovative stuff is happening in the sort of Flash space, where 2D has become 3D and you're starting to use that stuff. And so there's some interesting stuff going here on in here in the 2000s as sort of pixel shaders are advancing and moving along. And then what we have now at this point, we've had so this point we're talking sort of 2010 to 2015. We've had about 15 years of realism in the mainstay AAA game, and a lot of the innovative titles that aren't big budget or are a bit more strange, or MMOs where people are spending a lot of time, are a lot more visual, they're a lot bolder, they're a lot more out there. And so at this point you will you'll basically see, well, I'll just call it the color explosion. My brain has just okay, let's go with American. Color explosion. My brain was just like, do I do American or do I not? And my brain was just like, fuck it. So I would describe this as sort of the late PS3 era, and I describe this as the you've got, so also I should correct myself, by the way. Earlier when I said Nintendo had a little bubble here, it was somewhat replicated with sort of PS1 and PS2 games that weren't using so again, because they had some of this dedicated hardware and they had very low graphics memory and less lighting, that they were going a bit more realistic. But by sort of late PS2, early PS3, you've got this sort of realism kick happening on here, and a lot of it is driven by this pixel shader stuff. So yeah, PlayStation was in a similar place, but I'd say PlayStation was also starting to get more grimy even in the PS1 era. By PS2 era, they start firmly getting into the grime. But yeah, this color explosion largely comes initially against sort of the technical trend, but a lot of it's because of the MMOs, and a lot of it's because of just general art style fatigue. But as we move into sort of the PS4, the Xbone, and sort of, you know what, this is really a period that's dominated by Unity and UE4. This period here is really interesting because basically what's now happened is the tech has stabilized. Video texture memory is huge. On consoles, it's unified memory architecture, so you can go all the way fucking up. But even on PC, we're seeing very large sort of graphic things. So now we're starting to see artist-led styles come into the main. So this is where we start to dive into a whole spiel of people trying to uniquely identify their game with less technical ability, generally speaking, but more artistic ability. So there is a lot more work in garish shaders and bold art styles, and using some old school tricks that have already been established, sort of UV and stuff. And this now sort of becomes the trend. And there's one E3 in particular that pops to mind, the one where Sunset Overdrive was released, where this now became the new trend. Sunset Overdrive was one of those sort of trendsetters where it's like, okay, so we go big and we go bold. And at this point, AAA also starts, so start of PS4 we're talking about here, some other things start to happen. First of all, HDR happens, and we get physically based renderers, which have a bigger push towards how more vibrant colors fill up the space. In the AAA space, this pushes against some of the customized garish texture work because it's harder to do in there. As I say, it's very hard because we're talking about everything from AAA to indie, but we kind of have to focus on the AAA space because that's the area that's going to be pushed the most by tech. Because of HDR, we now no longer want quite a limited color space. We want those moments when you're a dark cave and you walk out into bright sunlight. That's the sort of the kicker moment for people. Because of physically based renderers, we want colors and stuff in the space to sort of bounce stuff around, but we can't go too garish with it. We can't have too much like glow stuff and things like that that's kicking around. But then sort of separate to the video graphics techniques, ProcGen is starting to become a big deal, and I think one of the techs that's probably the least understood by gamers that's made the biggest impact here is a technology called SpeedTree, or middleware company called SpeedTree. Basically, they allow foliage generation, and the amount of middleware, the amount of AAA games that use the SpeedTree middleware for a period of about 5 years, it was almost 90%, if not 99%. It was ridiculously high. So because of that, you started to see a lot more foliage. You started to see a lot more sort of forestry stuff kick in. And so this period, we've got a lot of color ramping. We've got a lot of dark to light stuff. And we've just got a shit ton of trees and natural environments. Oh yes, and because of a small detour I didn't mention, that was originally started by Carmack. This is pre-PS4, but it became baked into our current gen consoles and later current gen PC video cards. Is what Carmack called mega textures, but was later renamed to sort of partially resident textures, or there's another word for it on PC cards that I forget, but it's basically the ability for you to stream in textures in this mapped sort of layered memory architecture way. That could be a whole nother talk, but this also leads to a lot of really detailed paints. So this is a lot of where artists have gone in and they've actually, the tool sets for artists are changing at this point where they're able to actually go into the 3D geometry and they're starting to actually paint on in the levels rather than working separately on textures. So a lot more, I don't want to actually use the word realism here. I think a lot more naturalism comes into the art style. And that's kind of now where we are here with games like Spider-Man, games like Horizon, even things like Jedi, the latest Jedi game. Now there's outliers, which I'd say was still from the previous generation, and those outliers tend to be things like Fortnite. But now, the interesting thing about Fortnite is its art style, even though it boomed in popularity in this period, its art style was mostly defined pre-UE4, because Fortnite actually started as a tech demo to build out the Unreal Engine, as in like when the switch from UE 3.5 to UE4 was happening, the team inside Epic were using Fortnite as the game to push forward. It was really early, like before it was even open sourced as an engine. Like some of the original documentation was literally just screenshots and GIFs from their Fortnite game that was in development at the time. Because remember, it wasn't a battle royale when it started. And it came very much from this decade of MMOs and streaming textures and reusing. That's where its art style comes from. And so it's still very much in this legacy of decal texture design. So you do have some outliers in the space, but I would say realistically PUBG is more sort of representative of this period of development. But yeah, you do have outliers. Now, the gaming industry is so broad, we're never going to have a single congruent look anymore, even in AAA space. So this is current state of play. This is where we are today. However, we all know already on PC, we've seen PC RTX cards drop. And we know from public announcements, because I'm not going to talk about anything private, but from public announcements, both the PS5 and both the PS5 and the Xbox X Series XXX, fucking whatever their naming scheme, I cannot keep track in my head. We basically know all the new players. Ignore Nintendo, they don't play in the technology bubble. We know all the new players, whatever their fancy name for it, will have some level, ironically, pretty much everyone using AMD. My brain. AMD. AMD is scoring big in this game. So we know from all of this that pretty much everyone is investing in path tracing. There's other interesting techs happening, but path tracing or ray tracing, there's dedicated hardware now for this in all of the new stuff, and we know it's in PC land as well, and we've started to see some experiments in this space. Now we're in clear gas land and prediction land, but I'm pretty good at this stuff. So the question is, how does this affect game style and art style going forward? Will we see a new movement in art for this? Now, first of all, because of indies, because of diversification, because of just trying to discover different things, you will get things that have different art styles. So that goes without saying. But we should start off by looking at what is path tracing good at. Path tracing is great at bounce light. It's great at the Cornell box or the colored walls. We've got reflection, reflection and refraction for free, and transparency and shadow is easy. I'm going to put that in quotation marks as well, because I'm drawing with a big brush here. We've already seen one game that's leaned heavily into this, and that is Control, right? Now, we're going to jump back to the slide a bunch, so don't worry why I'm not explaining everything here all at once. So Control did some things very reminiscent of the first Quake game. They went with a brutalist art style, and that is because it gave them a lot of sort of sharp edges. It gave them less light sources, but harsher light sources. So, you know, because HDR is still in play. So what you're seeing there is you're seeing a lot of bounce light come into effect. Sorry. But because of how stochastic denoisers work, it's going to work better with flat surfaces and with harsh surfaces. You're going to see lots of metal and sort of shine in there. So that's the hard edges and the metal shine and stuff is, I think, going to start driving us back towards sort of some of the Quake style brutalism. Maybe not as harsh, because I don't think art directors will give up the degree of freedom they've had so much. They haven't been as influenced by that. But I think what you're going to see is you're going to see a lot more muted textures, because muted textures will play better with how light bounces around and how colors bounce around. But I also think what you're going to see is you're going to see blocks of color. So this doesn't necessarily mean a solid block of color, but for instance, if you've got like a brick wall, like a red brick wall, and then you've got like this green tapestry over it, that'll really get picked up by path tracing lights, and it'll really sort of bounce off. And so I think you'll see a lot of these money shots that use strong blocks of color in their display. I think we're going to get a lot more darkness. That is, I think, the thing we will see the most of. We're going to see less light. Our games are going to get darker, they're going to get grimmer, which is a bummer for me, because I personally don't like that. But I think we're going to see a lot more of that. You're going to see a lot more glass as well, because going back to, well, actually, I think this deserves a slide of its own. So this reflection, refraction being free and transparency being easy means we're going to see a lot of glass. We're going to see a shit ton of mirrors, because mirrors have gone from being ridiculously expensive to practically free. Mirrors are going to be a place where we'll get some artifacting, especially on people who are relying strongly on denoisers. So mirrors, you're going to see them, but you're going to see them in very controlled scenarios. You're going to see a lot of wet and water stuff. So this is going to be a lot of, oh yeah, we're going to see, along with glass, we're going to see a lot of crystal. So this is going to be, there's going to be some first-person shooters almost certainly that are going to have like crystalline caves. So, you know, you're going to almost certainly have in the next 2 to 3 years, probably 2 years, you're going to have a money shot, probably in an E3 trailer, maybe the next year actually. You're going to have a money shot in an E3 trailer where it's all dark caves, and the light source is around the corner, sort of shining through, and there's going to be maybe some glowy crystals and big glass crystals, sort of like, think Superman's Fortress of Solitude, and you're going to see a lot of sort of bending light through there, and you're going to see a lot of weirdness. Someone's going to get ambitious and do that, that particular setup where they're going to go. They're going to lean in hard to what the RTX stuff is really good at. Likewise, you're almost certainly going to see a shot or two where someone is playing around with a body of water, or they're going to have like blood on the floor or something like that, and the camera is going to do a pan up from the reflection into the actual thing. Now, easy to fake this with old tech, but it's going to look a lot better in the new one, because actually that makes me think, instead of using a body of water, actually they might just use a body of water, because if they use a body of water that's got waves and stuff, the refraction and the reflection would look really interesting. They might use a puddle of blood. If they're going to use a puddle of blood, the reason they'll do that is because the lip of the blood, or the lip of the goo, or the puddle or whatever, will also look really interesting, because it'll have that little sort of rim light effect. So you're gonna see that shot almost certainly. Yeah, you're gonna see a lot of wetness. Yeah, in terms of texturing, instead of cartoony stuff, we're going to see a lot of brushed metal. You're going to see a lot of chrome. Will you see much bark? See, bark doesn't really win out. Natural fibers kind of lose out on. It's interesting because on the one hand, I think you've got two opposing bits of tech here. You've got the middleware around sort of the speed tree, because it's very easy to proc gen natural environments, and so it makes it easy for artists to make big environments. But on the flip side, while RTX is while modern hardware, sort of next gen hardware, will be better than current gen hardware, it won't be a strength of next gen potentially. There's ways you could potentially use it, but I think because of proc gen environments and content costs, we're still going to see large outdoors and natural environments. But I wouldn't be surprised if they're darker. So yeah, I'll be interested to see how sort of natural stuff plays in. That'll be fascinating how that plays through. I'm uncertain of this. I think we'll still get a lot of natural environments purely because of content creation pipelines, but I think we'll get a lot of money shots and a lot of art styles that rely heavily on sort of brush metal and chrome and small LEDs or strong point lights is another way of putting that, because they'll have a little tiny strong point light will illuminate more than you think, especially in darkness. Can't say anything off the list I'm forgetting. Reflection, refraction, transparency I've already expressed. Shadows. Yeah, you're almost certainly going to see a game that leans into shadows hard. So you're almost certainly going to see sort of a thief or a stealth game that dynamic shadows and shadows looking gorgeous and just all of that stuff leans into hard. I would not be shocked if there's an announce of a game like that in the next year or so. I have no knowledge of one that I'm aware of. I might have knowledge, but I can't think of one off the top of my head. But yeah, you're going to see something that leans heavily into stealth and shadow tech. And I think those are going to be the biggest effects of RTS. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. There's other technology that'll come into play, but in terms of rendering tech, RTX, and sort of the history of where we've been, because again, video memory is still really huge. So freedom, like people have had more freedom, and you're going to see this more in the AAA space, where they build their own tech. Unreal and Unity games are going to lag behind. They just are. Right. With that, any questions before we conclude the recorded segment? Okay. In which case, we are going to conclude the recorded segment there. And for those of you on YouTube watching, this was filmed live on Twitch. Come join us in the mornings, and hope to see you when I see you.